Welcome to the Inconvenient Minority Podcast. I'm your host, Kenny Hsu. Joining me today is my guest, Daniel Di Martino. Daniel Di Martino is a writer. He's an academic. He's a PhD student at Columbia University studying economics. His family immigrated to Venezuela from Spain, ironically, to see a better life. Now he's in the United States. Venezuela's in rough straits, to say the least. Daniel, how are you?
Hi, Kenny. Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
So, Daniel, your family immigrated to Venezuela from Spain, ironically, to seek a better life. But what about Venezuela at the time was particularly attractive to you and your family?
Well, my grandparents, from my mom's side, they immigrated to Venezuela from Spain, and from my dad's side, they immigrated from Italy. And as many of your listeners might know, Spain in the 1950s was under a fascist dictatorship of Franco that had also destroyed the economy with excessive regulation, rationing of food, and it was a terrible place to live in if you were a poor person like my grandparents. So they immigrated to Venezuela, which at the time was the fourth richest country in the world, measured by GDP per capita. And the similar reasons for my dad's side grandparents from Italy, because Italy had just gone through World War II. And so they sought a better life in a very rich and open country that was Venezuela. And they honestly got it. The problem was what came afterwards, right? After Venezuela became a democratic country in the early 60s, the successive presidents started increasing the size of government. And then when I was born in 1999, Hugo Chavez took us down the path of socialism.
So when your parents arrived in Venezuela, and let's set the scene for a little bit. When your parents arrived in Venezuela in the latter half of the 20th century, had Chavez already taken power?
Well, my parents were born in Venezuela. It was my grandparents who immigrated. Chavez took power the month after I was born, and that was in January 1999 when I was born. He took power in February. He had been elected in December. And after he took power, everything started changing. And even as a kid, when he had already been for several years in power, things were much better than as I grew up, because inflation increased every year. Shortages became ever more prevalent. I started losing electricity in my home. I started not having running water many days per week. It was truly a disaster. Our middle class family went to be poor.
So what were some of the main policies that the Chavez government implemented at the start of his regime that started to lead to this backslide?
One of the main things they did was to start taking away companies. So in the logic of the members of the regime, wealth had been accumulated by the rich and powerful. And so what they did was to just take away their companies and supposedly put the workers in charge. The result was that those companies stopped working at all and stopped producing, and everybody was left unemployed. And, they implemented a currency control scheme that meant that the government would distribute and choose who would import and export out of the country. So trade was severely restricted, and so our economy also suffered. And then they started to give away everything for free: electricity, water, food, housing, and all of that was paid by printing more money and creating hyperinflation that made everybody poor.
So that's very interesting. So the Chavez government, in the name of helping workers, really just closed down businesses and gave the capital to, the corrupt government members. And of course, the businesses failed after that.
Yeah, look, there's a very classic case of that happening with agriculture. The agricultural sector was one of those that the state intervened the most in Venezuela. They took away vast amounts of land, Kenny. And all of that land, there's not a single example that still produces. And I'm talking about, according to estimates by the Venezuelan Chamber of Commerce, the government took 5 million acres. 5 million hectares. Sorry, not acres. And that's a huge proportion of our territory that was just taken away by the government and left totally unproductive. No wonder there's a shortage of food in our country. When trade is restricted and you destroy all the production inside, there's nothing left to eat.
And that's really tough. You kind of see how socialism is about redistributing the wealth that a country produces. And what I know about Venezuela is that it actually has a lot of wealth in the form of natural resources, particularly in oil. Did the prevalence of oil in the industry help sustain Venezuela through this crisis, or did it prove to be actually a factor in causing the downfall of this economic system?
That is a very interesting question, and it has been a subject of research for many decades. The so-called resource curse, that countries with more natural resources tend to become poorer or have worse governments. I'm not so sure. I think that it's a little bit of both. It's the part that, if we hadn't had oil, uh, we would be much poorer, right? Chavez was able to pay for some of the social programs through oil money, and that allowed us to not print as much money and so not have as high inflation. But because the government was in charge of the oil industry as well, now they're not producing anything. In fact, late last year, 2020, the number of active oil rigs in Venezuela pumping oil out of the ground reached zero for the first time since oil was discovered in the country in the early 20th century. Because there's no incentive to produce when the government owns it. There's only an incentive to waste. There's an incentive to employ workers and not make them work. And so that's exactly what happened. So I think oil sustained us for a little bit, but it's not a guarantee of prosperity. But it could help us. If we had free markets in Venezuela, we could easily become the Dubai of the Americas and be one of the richest countries in the world.
And that's interesting to think about when we think about the differences between a capitalist and a socialist country, because the funny thing is, you said Venezuela was a pretty rich country. It was a country that your parents immigrated to, actually, which is just so incredible to me when I think about the state of the situation today. But you see in places like Europe, for example, people characterize some of the economies of Europe as socialist, that have been doing better. Places like Sweden and Norway and Finland, Scandinavian countries, and Spain obviously has a very robust welfare state, and so does Greece. How would you characterize those economies?
Well, now my parents and grandparents moved to Spain and Italy, back where my grandparents were from, and because of necessity, because of having to leave Venezuela, of not being able to continue making a living in that country. But right now, it's incredible the level of regulation and taxation that you see in Spain. They take over 30% of your wage as a low income worker just to pay for social security and healthcare. And they're still broke, right? They still have to get in debt because it's not enough. And then they have over 20% sales taxes, and then they charge you an income tax on top of what they don't take already with payroll. And then they have incredibly high fuel taxes. Fuel is, we had to pay, my parents and I, over $6 per gallon of gas, when in Kentucky, where I'm living in the US, we pay less than $2 per gallon. They are just milking their population out of all of their money, and they're not getting anything in return. It's so sad, and you see so many young people unemployed. Just in Spain, over 1 in 5 young workers are unemployed, and this is before the pandemic. This economy is in total shambles.
Yeah, that's tough to think about. So when we go to, let's go back to the United States now. Now that you've kind of described Europe, and you kind of described the state of Europe, which is a characterization that that I would say I agree with. Right now, the United States, we are a country with free markets. Somewhat, we also have a pretty large welfare state. Now that you had experience in South America, in Europe, and the United States, what would you say is an important distinguishing characteristic of the United States that may help it avoid the pitfalls of the other two places that you've lived in? But also tell me about, a potential danger on the horizon in the United States that could lead to, becoming in a country that you've lived in.
Look, I think that the main thing the United States has got going for the country is that the American people love to make a living for themselves. They love the independence that brings. They just like they're more likely to own cars because that gives you more independence. They're also more likely to work at a young age when they're in high school in the summers and to know what money is worth. And that is so important because that is what Europeans and Venezuelans didn't have. And it is that culture of self ownership, as well as just the fact that the US Constitution really forbids many of the things that have happened in Europe and to a much worse degree in Venezuela, right? And it's much harder to change. However, the danger I see is that as the population has become more dependent in these long-standing welfare programs, there is an ever increasing demand for more. We saw it just a few days ago with the debate about the stimulus checks. People were mad about getting $600 stimulus checks from the government, and because they wanted 2,000. And if you gave them 2,000, how much did they want? 3,000, 4,000. What's the limit? Why should people who haven't been hurt by any economic crisis, receive money from the government in the thousands, get everybody in debt, and bankrupt the country? That is the danger I see.
Okay, so this is interesting. So you describe America's difference as fundamentally cultural. Now, you say it's enshrined by the Constitution, but you say that America has a culture of self-ownership that other countries that you lived in don't have. That's pretty interesting to me. My podcast is about race, identity, and culture, and oftentimes, we need to talk about culture and the culture in America. How would you say that America has a culture of self-ownership? Like, kind of give me an example of what you've seen in America that you think may not potentially be possible or recommended in other countries.
One of those things is that children here in high school work during their summers or even during school. And in college, I had a job, a part-time job to pay for my expenses as well. And so do many, if not.
Do they not in the countries that you live in right now?
Right, that does not happen in Venezuela. Now perhaps it does. People just drop out of college because no job gives them enough to eat. But in Europe, that's not common at all to work when you're in college or in high school, even less. That is just completely strange. You should focus just on your studies. I've talked with many student athletes, and they don't even have time to play their sports in Europe, which is why so many European student athletes move to the United States for college, because they are allowed to do both things at the same time. They're allowed to pursue their passions. They're allowed to work, to do what they think is best for themselves.
Interesting. So you're saying that in America, we have this cultural sense that you should work in high school. I mean, that's definitely what I was instilled with. When even my immigrant parents, I was always encouraged to take my first job. At 15, 16, I was always encouraged to help around the house. But yeah, I don't know, somebody who may, defend Europe or defend South American culture would say, well, we have a culture of work too. We just work for the family and try to do that instead of, try to take a job in the private sector or something like that.
Well, I think the difference is that when children at a young age know what work it takes to earn a paycheck, they also value more that you should keep more of that paycheck. And so I think that's one of the reasons why over time the United States has still had much lower tax levels than the European countries. And I think it's part of that. And I think it's also the immigrant culture. European countries are not used to having a lot of people who come without nothing and who want to make a good living for themselves and seek freedom. The United States was made by immigrants who were seeking freedom and continuously renews that spirit by bringing in new people like your parents, like myself coming to the United States. And I think that's what also keeps the light of freedom alive in the United States, in difference from Europe and other places.
Right. And, you just harken back to that quote by Ronald Reagan, it is the immigrants that keep this country forever young, right? Forever dreamers. Americans are dreamers. That's why when they come to this country, they keep it young by continuing to work and continuing to express that. Now, I want to transition to something that we've been talking about, sort of. But it is this idea of immigrant culture and the role that immigrants play in America, and especially within the American left, is pretty interesting. So right now, we have this ideology on college campuses, and you've seen it particularly well, given that you were you're a PhD student at Columbia. But right now we have this ideology that's gracing a lot of different departments and even economics, saying that people like you and me are people of color, and that we are being oppressed by white people in particular. How do you think that ideology is going to affect maybe the culture of hard work and self-sufficiency that you claim is helping to drive America's success, relative success compared to other nations?
I think that the educational system in the United States and the lack of stepping up by parents to fill up that gap is the biggest threat in the long term to freedom in America that we have ever faced. And it is because, look, I moved to the United States for college for my undergrad in Indiana over 4 years ago, 4.5. And one of the first things we did was a walk of privilege, where if you were white, you had to step a few steps ahead. If you were a man, you also had to step ahead. If you were a woman, you had to step back. If you, came from whatever arbitrary characteristic this messed up ideology put you in, you had to step ahead or behind, and therefore you had more chances in America because of that. They were already brainwashing young kids into believing that their chances are determined by unchangeable characteristics rather than by their own effort and by their learning or whatever else. And I think that's a huge danger, because that perpetuates the notion that the American dream is unreachable for many. And so the government has to step up and redistribute everything and be in control because we can't do it for ourselves. And that's a lie.
Wow. Well, that is such a powerful statement, Daniel. It betrays the notion that the American dream is available for anybody. I think that is so true. When you look at this ideology that tells you fundamentally that you are worth less in this society because you are a certain skin color or you are a certain gender or race or orientation, I think it really does betray the American dream in some sense. And I'm worried about, what happens when so many young people, as you see in college campuses today, are many of them immigrants, many of them coming to this country for exactly, the reasons so they could work hard, are getting wind of this ideology and how it might affect, our culture of hard work and self-sufficiency in the future.
And look, Kenny, I'm not saying that there aren't obstacles to prosperity or to achieving the American dream, whatever your American dream is in America. I'm just saying that it's not true what college campuses try to fill the minds of young people with, that you can't make it no matter what you do because of those characteristics that you have, or that it's nearly impossible. I'm saying that obviously there are things that we can fix, and there are policies that are obstacles to achieving whatever goals you have, but we cannot be overly negative in order to just change people's minds and tell them a fake reality, because that is also a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people start believing that they have no chances, then they will not even try, and then everybody will suffer because you didn't try to achieve your dream.
Right. The self-fulfilling prophecy, I think, is of the critical race theory and maybe some of the socialist philosophy that's coming on the left right now. I think that's a good word to use, self-fulfilling prophecy. I see a lot of people, immigrants like you and me, or not. I'm not an immigrant. I'm a child of immigrants, but I work and I talk to a lot of immigrants. My parents were immigrants and those kinds of things. I see a lot of immigrants, who come here very initially skeptical and hostile of the idea of socialism. But then I remember at my college campus when I was at Davidson College, there are a lot of people that quickly got into the zeitgeist going on in American college campuses, saying, oh, there are all these privileged people, we're oppressed. And I just thought, man, there goes our culture. Does that, how do you think that, we could even potentially stop this trend?
I think the thing that most people focus on, and I think it's a wrong way to stop it, or it's just a harder way than what we could do, is just force universities to change, or apply this policy or do this other policy. The truth is that we, all of us, have it in our own hands to teach our own children. And if conservative parents taught their children about incentives, about free markets, about the history of the United States, about, yes, the bad things that have happened in US history, like slavery and many others, but also how those things were overcome and how the United States is now a prosperous, free, and tolerant nation, I think that no matter what colleges do, they're not going to be able to brainwash children who already know from their parents, the people who they trust the most, who raised them, that things are different. So I think that there's been a failure by both the schooling system, but also by parents. I think that if parents were doing it right, we wouldn't see this changing. And I know I'm criticizing, but it's also a hope for us, because it means that if all conservatives taught their children well, then there's nothing that can change America forever, right? It's a really powerful thing what educating children gives you.
Yeah, exactly. And which is why I'm concerned about, the parenting literature coming out today. I don't know if you saw that Ibram Kendi, the great critical race theory scholar of today, who charges $40,000 a speech or something like that, and really capitalizes off of his success, released this book called Anti-Racist Baby, where it's literally directed at, young children and parents of young black and brown children. And it just goes on to talk about how, their position in society is lower, and how, they're being treated and discriminated against, at the very beginning of the book and throughout the end of the book. And you're supposed to read this to your kids at night. And in one sense, have people face discrimination? Of course they face discrimination. But I think that what books like this do is that it entrenches that discrimination in the psychology of somebody's life. It makes them believe that the problems that they have are entirely due to discrimination. And in short, that would define their life. I think that would define their mental trajectory. And I can't see a way that would be a good thing to a person.
Indeed. Look, most of our problems are not about external causes, are about ourselves and our own local communities. And most of them can be solved by ourselves, by fixing something in either something's going on in our home, something's going on in our job, or our community by fixing the road with a few neighbors, or the garden needs to be cut, whatever problem we're facing, most of them are of individual nature.
Daniel, this has been a great conversation. I only have maybe one more question. Where do you see your role in this battle between capitalism and socialism? Where how do you want to play your role? What is your next act?
Well, what I want to keep doing, thank you for asking that, Kenny, is to keep opening the minds of young people and also telling conservatives around the United States that the best way to change minds is not necessarily by, having fights online or things like that, but actually by engaging in one-to-one conversations with people in their lives and giving the example, right? Because most of the people on the left nowadays think that conservatives are bad people. You see it in polls that conservatives are racist, that conservatives are misogynist. And if you are a conservative and you show that we are normal, good people who care about others, no matter what they believe in, then we are already breaking that narrative and changing minds. So that's what we need to do. That's what I want to keep pushing for. And I speaking on college campuses. I do that to promote that narrative so that people can implement it in their own lives, and also doing more of reaching out to parents so that they also know how to talk to their children about socialism and capitalism, and using my story as a resource for them. Because if something I want to do with the bad things I went through because of the socialist system is to use it to stop it from ever happening again. So it's an honor for me to do that.
Well, it's an honor to have you on the podcast, Daniel. I really appreciate all the work that you do. I've been following you for a while now. And I'm just grateful to have your voice being heard throughout the world.
Likewise, Kenny. And if your followers want to reach out to me, they can reach out to me on Twitter at Daniel Di Martino, or, on Facebook as well. On my website, it's just my first name and last name, DanielDiMartino.com.
Yes. Please give Daniel Di Martino a follow and ask him for any questions. He's always an open book. Thank you so much, Daniel. I really appreciate your story. Look forward to talking with you soon.
Thanks, Kenny. You too.
In Venezuela, they took away the companies and supposedly put the workers in charge. But the result was that those companies stopped working and stopped producing, and everyone was left unemployed. That's what Daniel Di Martino told me in our interview. And it reminds me of another country. It reminds me of China. I remember this story, and I write about this in my book, in Inconvenient Minority. But I remember this story of a Chinese guy that I interviewed who works in America, who lives in America, but recently went back to China. But the reason why he left China, this man, his name is Jun, was an extremely smart individual. Got amazing test scores, got into the best Chinese colleges. This was back in the 70s and the 80s. But he really wanted to study economics. He was an intellectual, and wherever he went, he would have added great value to wherever he went. But in China, the only thing you could study in economics was Marxism. You could only study Marxist economics. And I remember him telling me, you cannot study economics and be a Marxist. It's just impossible if you care at all about society. So he left China and he came to the United States and worked here for about 25 years. Now he's lured back into China somewhat. And, that's an issue. Those are interesting issues to address. But fundamentally, right, when you implement socialist and Marxist policies, the first people who leave while they still can are the intellectuals, right? Are the business owners, are the people who start businesses, are the producers in the economy. People like Daniel Di Martino and his family. His family worked their way up, became, members of the Venezuelan middle class actually fled to Venezuela from Spain. I mean, think about that. And then they had to, of course, and then Daniel had to flee from Venezuela after it became the way it did now. And he has an incredible story, and so does June from China. And it just shows me that one of the biggest products of socialism is this decline in culture of excellence. We were hitting on a number of topics, Daniel and I, but I wanted to use what we were talking about. I wanted to talk about a couple of things. One, I want to talk about differences between countries. You know, there's this movement going on today, especially in academia, called multiculturalism. The ideology of multiculturalism believes that every country fundamentally has equal validity, and every culture fundamentally has equal validity as another culture. You know, we could go all casuistry here, and I could critique this ideology immediately by pointing out, so you think the Aztec culture, where they sacrificed thousands and thousands of children, you know, in the altar of the gods, is an equal culture to what American culture is today. And, you know, the multiculturalist would have to defend that in some way. But in reality, I don't even have to go that far back in history. I can even just talk about now. I can even talk about Venezuela. We could even talk about Europe. You know, Daniel, it's interesting. I didn't even really mention Europe to Daniel, and Daniel still wanted to talk about, you know, his time spent in Europe. And the fundamental assertion that Daniel made was that in Europe, they don't have the culture of hard work that they do in the United States. Now, that's pretty interesting. And the way that he asserts that, you know, in high school in America, everybody is encouraged to get a job or get an internship. You know, my first job when I was born, I was raised here. My first job was at a Jersey Mike's. I remember, you know, when I was 16 years old and I was a junior in high school, and I said, you know, I needed a little money. My dad said, well, why don't you go get a job? You know, I had mowed lawns and did those kinds of things, and I'd studied hard, but, you know, maybe I should have kept studying, but instead I went over and I got a job at a Jersey Mike's. I was the youngest person there. You know, I remember my first mistakes, some very embarrassing mistakes. I remember when I tried to make a giant sandwich and the toppings just kept falling out, and the customer was getting kind of flushed and red. And my manager came up to, you know, this counter, and he's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, I'm sorry. This is too big of a sandwich," because the customer was ordering so much stuff, and the manager was like, just forget it. And he like took my entire sandwich and he threw it in the trash can, like right in front of me, and he made another sandwich. And that was the day I thought I was going to get fired. Fortunately, I didn't, and I stayed the entire summer. And guess what? That taught me so much. That taught me so much more than a semester at school would have. About hard work, about resilience, about getting along with your teammates. The little minimum wage job that I worked at Jersey Mike's, think about that, gave me the kind of skill, gave me the kind of personal skill, gave me the kind of work ethic, showed me a little bit about what the working world was like, and most importantly, gave me confidence. Gave me confidence to say, yeah, I can work in any industry. I can do whatever I need to do. You know, so that is an experience that Europeans, according to Daniel, have less of. And maybe that is because, maybe the hypothesis is because they've been under social welfare policies for longer than the United States, longer and broader, right? I mean, in Europe, you know, I remember during the 2008 recession, you know, when Greece basically went bankrupt, you know, people asked, why Greece? Why did Greece go bankrupt? Well, Greece had a debt to consumer ratio of like 150%, which meant that like their average GDP, their GDP that year, you had to multiply it by 1.5 to see the amount of debt they had to pay back. That's a huge amount of debt. And the United States is approaching that too, by the way. But Greece financed effectively a luxury state for a very long time under the boom years in 2000. What happened? Well, it made people lazy, okay? Multiculturalists, of course, would deny this. They would say, oh, no, you can't call people lazy. Well, of course you can. Of course you can call people lazy. You know, every parent knows when a child is being lazy. And everybody knows that when you spend way too much and you give people way too many entitlements, you foster laziness. I mean, what else do you think is going to happen? Do you think people are going to work hard when they're disincentivized to work hard? So Greece, had lived under this big luxury state for a very long time. And then when the 2008 recession hit, they basically completely went under. Their unemployment rate went to like 25, 30%. And by the way, after this coronavirus pandemic, Spain, countries like Spain, which suffered similar fates as Greece, they didn't go completely bankrupt, but they had to undergo vast austerity measures. Before the coronavirus pandemic, Spain's unemployment was still very high. And now it's much, much higher, and it's doubtful that it will recover in the next 10 years, according to Daniel, and according to many economists, really. If we believe in multiculturalism, this is the kind of behavior that we are condoning. This is the kind of government behavior and the kind of wastefulness that we are condoning. Because we believe that, people don't change. Human nature is inherently good. People aren't lazy. If people have no incentive to work, they're still going to work hard. No, that's to put it this way, that's actually a very ignorant thing to say. It's funny how you call a multiculturalist ignorant, because I bet they believe that they are the most enlightened people in the world, But Thomas Sowell always had this line that I really liked. Yeah, that idea is so dumb, only an intellectual could believe in it. And actually, Thomas Sowell, I bring up this Washington Examiner column that Thomas Sowell wrote in 2013. The intelligentsia, I'll read this to you. The intelligentsia burst into indignation or outrage at gaps or disparities in educational, economic, or other outcomes, and denounce any cultural explanation of these group differences as so-called blaming the victim. This is what a multiculturalist believes. He believes that if there is a gap or a disparity across the world, it is because of some kind of oppression. It is not at all because of culture. Okay, look, we're not going to deny that oppression plays a role in people's society. But who has been historically oppressed in the United States? Who's faced systemic discrimination in the United States? Jewish Americans. Also what? Asian Americans. And yes, Black Americans. Various Black Americans and various Latino groups have faced, I would argue, Black Americans have faced the worst discrimination in America. And I think that comparing Latino discrimination to Black discrimination is very unfair to Blacks. I would say to Black Americans, that would be a very, very unfair thing to say. But each of these groups, even in the very coarse and generalized language that we're even talking about race, like the idea of the Black person corresponds to 15% of American society, cannot possibly generalize at that high of a level. But, even different cultural groups have different GDP per capita, even though, all of them have faced some level of discrimination. And Asian Americans actually have a higher median income than whites, even though Asian Americans did not come from privilege and have faced more discrimination than whites in many cases. Okay, well, why is that? How do you explain that? Can you explain that because of multiculturalism? No. I would argue there's a cultural explanation there. I would argue that Asian Americans put their bets in things that tend to give greater middle-class stability. I would say that comes at expensive sacrifices. I would say that does. You cannot say that is an entirely positive attribute, because it comes at sacrifices for Asian Americans, which I will go into in later podcasts. But I think that is a very clear critique of multiculturalism that we can talk about. One, the situation of Europe and the situation of what happened with Greece and Spain. And Germany, funny enough, didn't undergo the same kind of austerity measures that Greece and Spain underwent during the 2008 recession. Why? You could argue maybe they had a better government. Well, why do they have a better government? Well, they had a lower welfare state, and, it is possible, and I'm going to throw out this hypothesis. I'm going to throw out this hypothesis and leave you guys to contend with it. But it is just simply possible that Germany potentially just has a better culture of excellence. I mean, you look at the average GDP productivity per capita of German people, and it is indeed higher than the average productivity of many other European nations. When Angela Merkel ascended to the throne of the EU and basically controlled everything about what happening was in the EU, the reason why she had any leverage at all was because Germany was the industrial center of Europe. Okay, Germany was producing greatly disproportionately to what they were consuming as part of their obligations to the European Union. And a lot of Germans, by the way, really resented that. Whereas other countries were perceived as consuming much to a greater degree than what they were producing in terms of their obligations to the European Union. You know, places like Spain, like Greece, those kinds of things. So Daniel's analysis is very interesting. It's something we as Americans, I think, need to contend with as our culture of excellence also comes into contention. Because Daniel lived not only in Europe, but he also lived in Venezuela. Venezuela, a land of many, many natural resources, one of the richest natural lands in the world, squandered it. Absolutely squandered it under their current government. And oil money, by the way, kept the Chavez government afloat for a little while, but it couldn't keep it afloat forever. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing the roosters come back home, come back to crow. What's that line again? Somebody can post it in the comments, I'm sure. Okay, it just seems rather obvious to me. It just seems rather obvious to me that if you go and you punish the companies that produce things, and you try to put the workers in charge, so-called, that the producers who have learned all of these skills and gained the expertise and have become productive members of society that have given people prosperity in that country like Venezuela are not going to take to it too well. And that the consumers of those luxury goods, are not going to take to it too well when those luxury goods are taken away from them. And that is what happened in Venezuela. Now, we got to compare this with the United States, of course. The main thing that the United States has got for us, according to Daniel, is that we love working and making a living for ourselves. We love the independence it gives us. And this is a kind of different perspective from what I was talking about with James Lindsay in the first podcast, because in podcast 1 with James Lindsay, I was talking with him about about how his rural white Appalachian culture actually did value hard work. They just placed their bets in the wrong things. It was pointless work. But I said in that podcast, at least they value hard work. At least they value hard work, right? That at least they have that going for them. And there are some cultures in some countries where they don't even have that, where they're almost entirely reliant upon the government. When we're talking about things that we as Americans need to consider from other countries like Venezuela and Europe, we really do need to talk about, well, why is America in the position that it is in the world today compared to places like Europe, who has existed for a much longer period of time than America has and was more powerful than America arguably just 100 years ago? We need to ask questions like, well, why is China ascending? You can't just say population, because China's population was almost, I think a greater portion of the world's population back in 1970, yet it still had a terrible reputation in the world. Now it's ascending. Why is that? In the span of just 50 years, China has been able to change the narrative about itself. Well, you have to go back to culture. You have to go back to cultures of excellence. You have to go back to what's being cultivated. China suppressed the productivity of its people for a very long time, drove intellectuals out during the Cultural Revolution, put everything under Maoism and tried to make an ideological revolution. And that stunted the country for many years. Many years. It's still muddling through that today. It still is muddling through that today. But at the same time, China is in a much better place than it was 50 years ago. A much better place. Even going back to attract people like Jun, who I was talking about at the beginning of the podcast, saying he fled China to come to America so he could study real economics. And then China was able to lure him back, and a lot of Chinese Americans are actually in this position today, especially first generation Chinese Americans, who, by the way, are some of the country's most highly skilled and highly educated workers. It's why you see Facebook, 95% of the software engineers there are Asian or Asian American. Chinese Americans, especially those that come from educated backgrounds that worked really hard, that come to this country in the 80s and 90s, are now facing difficult decisions about staying here or coming back because China is dangling rewards in front of them. Many promises of monetary reward. And everybody's got to make their own choices. But I can tell you what, a lot of Chinese Americans are tempted by that. And I'll tell you what, sometimes you have to make the choice between stability and monetary success and financial success and freedom. That is a difficult choice to make. These Chinese Americans would not be in this position today of having to make that choice unless China in some way rectified or was able to resolve some of the issues regarding its culture of excellence just 30 years ago. And now China is in ascending power. And now America has to watch out. We have to watch out for our culture of excellence. I want to talk one more thing. I want to talk about multiculturalism. I want to talk about the damage that multiculturalism can do in American society. So I want to read to you guys this Ibram Kendi tweet. He said that multiculturalism or denying multiculturalism is assuming that, and I quote, standardized cultures of white folk. That is, he believes that if we reject multiculturalism, that we just want everybody to be like white people. So let's break down this tweet. Kendi is obviously an anti-assimilationist. He does not want minorities to assimilate into the American dream or into American society. He believes that America is inherently bad. He believes that America is inherently racist. And he believes that if we try to standardize cultures, standardize things like English, then we are assimilating people into an American culture. Well, yes, the answer is, of course. If you are standardizing a language, you are assimilating people into that language. The issue that I have with this tweet is assimilating people into a common language is a good thing for that person. 99 times out of 100, it's a good thing for that person. I mean, sure, you can always, if you are a poor black child in the inner city, and Thomas Sowell argues this too, I'm not the only one who argues this, but if you're a poor black child in the inner city speaking Ebonics and speaking black English, so-called black English, I hate using that word, so I'm actually going to stop using it, speaking Ebonics, and a jagged form of English, and you are not learning standardized English, sure, you can always go back to speaking that jagged form of English when you're with your friends. But in polite society, it always helps you to know someone else's language and someone else's way of speaking, right? Look, I'm an Asian American, okay, but I was raised with standard English, and that has definitely helped me. I was a good student at writing, and that enabled me to, I would say, make a lot more connections in society than I would have if I was bad at writing, if I was bad at speaking. That was because I learned standard English. And another thing that I did when I was in middle school is I learned Spanish. And I speak decent conversational Spanish. I'm pretty happy about that because it enables me to talk with different people, and it enables me to touch the hearts of different people. Right? With a lot of Latino Americans, a lot of Mexican Americans who I just run into and I talk to. If you speak Spanish to them, they're impressed. They like you a little more, right? Don't people want to be liked? Don't you want to be liked? Don't you want people to respect you? Well, if you want people to respect you, you should probably learn standard English. So what Ibram Kendi really is doing by arguing against assimilation and arguing for multiculturalism, by saying all cultures are equally valid, all groups are equally valid, is that he is he is encouraging people to reject American society and basically make themselves outcasts. I don't know. Maybe you want to be an outcast. Maybe you like being an outcast. Maybe being an outcast is comfortable for you. I can tell you this. Being an outcast is not comfortable for me. It's not comfortable for me. It's probably not comfortable with the majority of people in the country. We want affection. We want family. We want friends. And in doing so, yeah, maybe you have to sacrifice a little bit. But I would argue it's not even really sacrifice. Because I already said, learning a different language or learning standard English, you can always go back and you can speak your native language and you can speak your native tongue with your friends, but you can learn differently in a polite society. And I think that can only help you. It can't hurt you. So I don't know what Ibram Kendi is trying to get at, by arguing against assimilation and arguing for and saying that assimilation is standardizing the culture of white folk. But I can see, young black kids reading Anti-Racist Baby, which is a kid's book by Ibram Kendi, and reading, all of those black and brown authors who totally are bought into this cultural relativism. And maybe looking at that kind of thing and saying, yeah, screw America, screw white people, screw standardized English. I'm not going to learn those kinds of things. And I feel really sorry for them. I feel really, really, really sorry for them. One of the people that I met while writing my book was this man named Marcus. And he was in a Baltimore inner city school. And he was a smart dude. He was a bright dude. And he's in college now, actually. He's in college now, and thank goodness for that. He's getting his associate's degree. But I remember speaking to him. I was like, what's it like being in a Baltimore inner city school? He said, I never felt like any class was challenging enough for me. I was like, did they have gifted and talented programs in that school? He's like, no. You know why? Because they did not preach excellence at those kinds of schools, especially academic excellence. The excellence that was preached was athletic excellence. That's exactly what he told me. But academic excellence was not enforced. So he felt like an outcast because he was smart. If you're a smart person, you should be allowed to pursue your interest. If we want to have a culture of excellence, and if we want actually to close achievement gaps, especially among racial minorities, especially for people like Marcus living in inner city schools like Baltimore, you better bet we can't buy into this multiculturalism ideology and say, yeah, you're perfectly fine the way you are. Your school's perfectly fine the way it is. Your English is perfectly fine the way it is. No, we need standards. We need excellence. We need to cultivate excellence. I'm going to close with a Thomas Sowell quote about multiculturalism. The biggest losers for multiculturalism in all this, and he writes in the Washington Examiner, the biggest losers in all this are those members of racial minorities who allow themselves to be led into the blind alley of resentment and rage, even when there are broad avenues of opportunity available. And we all lose when society is polarized. Reject multiculturalism. Fight for this country. Fight for this country's culture of excellence. Fight for our ability to have hard work define us. You're listening to the Inconvenient Minority Podcast. I'm your host, Kenny Shu. Please subscribe. Leave a review. I really want your review as I talk about these hard-hitting issues about race, identity, and culture in a way that is independent-minded. We interview independent thinkers and free thinkers. Support me if you can. I really appreciate your listening here. Talk to you soon.